Okay, so we're recording, and welcome to the Still Ill Corona Diary COVID Culture Talks. I'm Monique, who is the creator, I guess, of the Still Ill Corona Diary, and I'm joined today with Susie Hamilton. Hello.
Hi.
And Priyan Odedra.
Hey. Yep.
Dr. Priyan Odedra.
You can just say Priyan.
Okay, and I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you both for being open to talk with me and those that are joining us today about your work. Susie, your artwork that you've done during lockdown, and Priyan, your photographs that you've taken while working as a junior doctor at Homerton Hospital of your colleagues. I want to first of all just say that this series of conversations aims to raise the visibility of the coronavirus and its impact on the community and individuals, and that today I ask those that are sort of watching potentially to donate, if they can, to a charity which is the NHS Altogether Charities. And so, yeah, I was thinking we could start off going into the slideshow, which I'll do a little introduction and then it will go straight into Susie, if that's okay. Right, if you just say next when you want the slide to go forward, then we can go from there, and we'll have a break after we finish, and then we can all three of us talk about your work. Okay? Excellent. So I'm just going to share the screen now. Just be one moment. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay, so this is the beginning page, and then this is the charity, which is the NHS Charities Together, which is donations helping essential support for NHS staff and volunteers. There's a link in my bio for donations. And then over to you, Susie, with your C19 series.
Okay, so I just start talking about it then. All right.
Yes, please.
This is a view of my studio lockdown, which was in our kitchen in Mile End, East London. And these are just a few of the early pictures I did in April from images sent me by a consultant hepatologist in a Bristol hospital called Dr. Peter Collins. And he thought that the subject of COVID wards and doctors and nurses would suit my work, which is to do with light, with figures in dangerous or bleak settings, and often isolated figures as well. So that's just a little view of my work in general. Next, please, Monique. This is one of the pictures of a doctor looming over a patient, because I was thinking of, I was imagining myself in the patient's predicament and doing the pictures from the patient's point of view. So it's like I'm on the bed with this helpless claw hand and the doctor coming over me and looming over me, and the sort of frightening aspect. Although the doctor is a figure of healing and goodwill, I often made him or her slightly frightening or alarming or alien. Okay, next, please. And this one's called Emergency, and I did a series of works in charcoal, and the idea of these figures, some of whom are rather strange looking with their visors. A lot of my work's to do with figures masked and made mysterious or rather frightening with veils or hoods or visors. And so I've been going to town on this slightly frightening aspect of the hidden, cloaked doctor. And I was influenced by pictures of plague doctors in the Middle Ages or 16th, 17th century with their beaks and hoods and strange garments. Okay, next. This one I think is called Ghostly Doctors, and I did some behind blinds that you see in photographs. And I was thinking of reports I'd read or heard about of people coming around from COVID who are slightly confused or having hallucinations. And the idea of the doctors and nurses kind of being these floaty shapes, slightly cloudy and misty and milky, through the consciousness of the patient who is not quite awake or not quite right, having these strange impressions. Okay, next. This is another mask, and a lot of my work is to do with virus clusters that hover over figures, and we'll see that in my beach paintings in a bit. And the strange stain behind the head is like a blown up nucleus or a molecule or a virus that has somehow fixed itself to the face or attacked the figure. And I used a lot of these peculiar shapes of masks to make the doctor or nurse more strange, almost non-human. And I also emphasized the eyes as communicating a sense of either fear or helplessness. And even though the doctors and nurses may not feel those things, I suppose I imported into them this feeling of wide-eyed fear or slightly helpless wonder at what they were seeing. Okay, next. I hope I'm not saying too much. Next, Monique, please. And again, this is a masked figure. It's one for the Art Car Boot Fair opening on Sunday, an online exhibition. And I was thinking of the doctor like a miner underground, going through these dark and frightening areas, wearing this respirator. And I was just aware of as I've felt in Priyan's photographs, aware of the huge burden of all this PPE and the human figure trapped and isolated behind the paraphernalia. And light and dark are very important in my work. And here I've got the contrast of the illuminated face against the black. Okay, next please, Monique. And here light, of course. Some of my figures are frightening and almost like ghoulish, Hieronymus Bosch creatures. And others are slightly angelic, with light shining from them or shining on them. And it's both the bleak light, the bleak neon light of a hospital ward, and the sort of spiritual light that you see in nativity scenes where light is bursting from the figures, a saint or Jesus or something. And the other thing about these pictures, I did several of these doctors gathered around the bed. I was thinking of it like between two worlds. There's the world of the patient on the bed approaching another world of these spectral ghostly figures, like death or an afterlife, or there are two worlds colliding, the reality we know and this kind of incoming frightening or unusual reality. Okay, Monique. Another mask with eyes that I wanted to be slightly, I did a series of lorises, you know, the little animal with wide-eyed, innocent eyes, and these eyes reminded me of the loris because they're sort of, they don't quite know what's going on. Yeah, I quite like this head because I just find it quite touching. And the man is putting on his PPE in readiness for some ordeal. Okay, next please. This is a quote from The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which is an early, back in 1880 something, sci-fi novel. And sci-fi has been influencing my work, and we're mentioning it here because at the end of the time machine, there's a scene on a beach where the Earth is being destroyed, really. It's kind of millions of years from now, and it's the destruction of Earth with a red beach and a dark sky. And this novel, as well as the film 2001, influenced a series of beaches I did back in 2004, which kind of predicted in an uncanny way this virus. Next, please, Monique.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. I did a series of beaches with these hovering cells threatening or just drifting over this hedonistic scene of leisure, people congested on beaches. And as I said, they're partly influenced by this scene in Wells's novel, partly by the black skies and the white ground of science fiction films like 2001, Space Travel, and so on, where the moon is white and the sky is black. And they were also influenced by work that I did on a 17th century poet, Andrew Marvell, who wrote about early microscopy and cells. And I started blowing up the idea of the cell, blowing up the cell, so that the cell loomed over or threatened the human figure. I'm rushing a bit, Monique, because I don't want to take up too much time. Okay.
Take time, honestly.
And this is another beach with the red sky that you get in the H.G. Wells quote, and this menacing background, but the figures don't seem to know or care, with these strange viral phenomena floating above them. Okay. Next, please, Monique. Or is that it?
That's it.
Oh, yeah, this is Monique's picture. This is what you found of a charming beach scene at the beginning of when was this? In April?
That's right. I think it might have been a bit later than April, and it's from the USA Today. And it just had this photograph where the police were completely overstretched. And I think they said it was a sort of coastline crisis because of the amount of people flocking to the beach when we're having one of those heat waves this year.
Yeah. It's like Bournemouth. I thought it was Bournemouth, but it's not.
It may very well be. If it wasn't Bournemouth, I know that Bournemouth did have a similar situation, and I just thought that it was part of the reason for also including your these beach work.
Well, it's like my work. If there was some viruses hovering over those people, it'd be like my beach scenes. But I it's strange looking back that I did them so long ago, because I'm afraid they've been rather prescient.
Yes, I think I'll take it off the presentation in a moment, but I was just going to say, looking at these sides, can you remind me when you painted these beach scenes?
Yeah, 2004. That was a bit late, 2006 or something. And I did masses of them. I couldn't stop, and they were all really. That's a really bad slide, the Lime Beach, but that was 2010. I can't remember.
Right, and then just going back to, and it's interesting that you were inspired at the time by this text that you had spoken with me about before from H.G. Wells, who we are probably all familiar with as the sort of science fiction writer, and it's from Time Machine, and I just thought, wow, like it's
yeah, I haven't thought of that. I've been in a time machine.
That's right. You painted these paintings. With this scene in mind, which is about time travel, and then in light of this conversation taking place now, I think that's quite interesting to show how, I don't know, serendipity or you've had this interest in your work. It's not like you've just been painting this C19 series. You've got a kind of history of an interest in disease and the effect on the masses and fear. So that's why I wanted to include these earlier works of
Good idea. I mean, just briefly, this medical interest started when I did a series of white figures on black backgrounds that were sort of translucent like x-rays. That was back in 2000. And you could see through to veins and sinews and cells and so on. And so, and cells escaping from the bodies. And I called them mutilates because they were figures both mutilated and mutating. And this sort of, I became medically absorbed then. So I've often brought these cells into my work because they're the unseen. It's as if there's this unseen life going on, whether it's benign or viral. And it's something that's threatening the human figures in my paintings.
Well, thank you so much for
Thanks for listening. I hope I didn't go on too long because our time is short. I don't want to take time from you, Priyan.
Well, no, thank you so much.
No, I was you were showing us. Thank you.
Yeah, and I thought sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say, first of all, just in response to what you've said, that but I'm somebody who has had no background in hospitals or sort of medical situations, and I really identify with the perspective of your works of the C19 series, because it really, I think it really tackles the psychological impact of being disoriented in a hospital. I luckily never have been admitted, but from my brief visits to A&E, the colours of the high contrast between black and white and the sort of PPE kind of othering, I think, medical professionals.
Yes, making strange. I'm glad you feel that. I mean, I haven't been in hospital much, thankfully, touch wood. So I was just kind of really responding to the ideas and the news and the images that I saw on the telly and so on.
Yeah, I think that I was going to ask Priyan, did you, as somebody who's been working in hospitals as a junior doctor throughout this, I wondered what you felt of the drawings and, if anything, what your thoughts are.
So, I mean, to start with, they were obviously really impressive, and I wouldn't say that I'm art-minded at all. So it was really helpful to hear you talking about your work as a whole, and it really helped me follow. Interesting, sort of, I was trying to look at the images and think about how I felt, and then listening to what you said. And the particular image, the one with the person looming, was the one that struck me the most. Because you're right, I think doctors and nurses are seen as a force of healing, but in that instance you described them as alarming or alien, and that you get that from the picture, someone that's towering over. Yeah. And actually, when that immediately reminded me of times that we were strangers. I mean, people could barely see our eyes, and they took our word for who we were, and we'd wade in because we'd been told that that person was sick enough to come to intensive care or might be sick enough, and we'd walk in and introduce ourselves, and from that moment expect trust. And that was because we had no time to build that trust often. And these people who, you know, we're all here obviously speaking English with an English accent, but there were a lot of people in the hospital language, or you know, it was completely foreign to them or had never been to a hospital, and suddenly there was this person in PPE who perhaps made them feel like an alien, who made that patient feel like, you know, a risk because they had to be covered. And you know, that really struck a note with me, really, because I can imagine, I can't imagine really being in that situation, and I can imagine looking at someone who looked like how I might have looked or how my colleagues might have looked, although behind all of that veneer of stuff that was in the way, we just wanted to help.
Yes.
But, you know, and I know that people tried to put on pictures of themselves on the front or whatever, but that was all an attempt to try and connect in some way.
Yeah.
But that was, yeah. So I really got that. And the picture with the plague doctors, the emergency,
yeah.
that's a scene that I feel like I've seen so many times, and I've been on the outside of or on the inside of. And there's one figure in there, I think it's the one sort of on the middle to the right of the, you know, our right of the patient, and that sort of towering, quite strong-armed figure, and you could see from the elbow the way, and they look like they're in, and that's sort of, I can just picture that, and that seems to happen in emergency departments all over. So I thought, considering you'd taken these from pictures, or the photographs that you'd drawn these from?
Photographs, and then I'd draw from the photograph and then mess around with the composition a bit, and then just use my own. I mean, I suppose I was gripped with fear and horror, and I suppose I just kind of injected my feeling into imagining what it was like, and feeling that I might go there sooner myself, you know.
Well, that really comes through, and I think you know that it was through effect, you know, not that, but you almost feel like you'd been at the scene and then you'd compiled all of that into one thing. So that's how I felt during those. And I'd say, like I mentioned, that the one with the looming really struck with me.
Looming, that's inspired me. Thank you.
It's so interesting having you both sort of interact, and because Susie, as you said at the beginning, you sort of had a makeshift space at your home, and you usually work in the studio, but because of lockdown you've been relatively isolated. And then it's very interesting, there are some like similarities I think between your work, so it's going to be interesting after seeing Priyan's talk sort of through his images, to compare. I think maybe I will go into the slideshow then, if you're happy, unless either of you want to say anything else.
That's yeah. Let's do it.
Images to say. I've got things I want to say.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to just get the PowerPoint back up. Okay, so here we are. So over to you with the pre-anecdotes, starting with this photograph.
Okay, so this is, I'm going to speak about everyone, sort of, they were colleagues, but I think either before or during or after, very much my friends. And so I'm going to speak about them very personally. So this is Manon, and she's the same grade of junior doctor as me, but she's an emergency doctor. But the way our training program works is that we rotate around sort of in a similar way for 3 years, and we go through acute medicine and emergency medicine, and we do a bit of anaesthetics and intensive care in our first 2 years, and then we sort of focus on what we're doing. So while I'm focusing on anaesthetics and probably intensive care, Manon is someone who's focused on emergency medicine. But we were together in our intensive care block and eventually in our anaesthetic block, and were redeployed together to intensive care during the pandemic. The reason why this picture is particularly unique is it's one of the only ones I took outside. So when I started this project, I actually didn't know where it was going, but I wanted to take pictures of my colleagues, and I wanted it to be where they felt their story could be told. So we tried 1 or 2 pictures of Manon inside, and actually they didn't work. Manon's quite a reflective person. And so we sort of went on a walk around the hospital sort of after one of our shifts. And we found this quite quiet spot, and we were just chatting, and this picture came about, and it was actually Manon talking about some of the thoughts that she had during the pandemic, and this sort of happened. And if you look at the picture, the face that Manon's at, she's slight furrowed brow, and and she's looking at her hands and picking at her nails, and that's to me is someone who's thinking but trying to contain, and that's probably how a lot of people felt. And the scrubs are mismatched here, and she's wearing her Crocs. Everyone has these bland Crocs, but Manon has these really colourful printed Crocs, and that's who she is. But for this entire thing, she was someone who was, you know, like many people, felt backed against a wall and still going. But those aspects of her personality are still there, the vibrancy. But this is what some people felt reduced by. And, you know, I asked everyone to have a little think about their thoughts and put it down on paper. And I thought that would be cathartic for people. And Manon took ages to send me something. But I was so grateful that and it's because she found it incredibly difficult. And I was so grateful when she did send it to me, because it was so powerful and it embodied so many things that I'd thought about or not even thought to think about that came forward. And it brought back sort of memories that I tried to suppress, but in the same way made me feel really hopeful that there was someone who'd shared that experience with me. And we definitely shared a lot of experiences together and a lot of, you know, bumps into each other in the corridor, or if we got a few moments to sit down and have our lunch, we were sort of going through the same thing. And that's why this picture is powerful to me, because it's the image of someone who's vibrant and exciting and fun, who brings a lot of joy to my life, and definitely did for the time that I was working with her. But this is also what healthcare workers or people that were going into work to deal with this thing were reduced to. You can obviously see what she said. I don't want to sort of read out what she said or what anyone said, because that's their personal story, and I put that on my Instagram page. But this is what that picture meant to me, and I think the focus is entirely on her in this image. And I like that I did the picture from the ground up, because you've got this blur that builds up to her, and she's the thing in the middle of it, and she's the person in the thick of it. There's something quite calm about it as well, and quite pensive and quite reflective. And it was one of the first pictures, I think it was the first picture I put up, because that's what the whole thing was about. It was about reflection.
Okay, thank you.
So this is V, and she's actually tuned in listening. So hey V. This was one of the first pictures I took as well, and we took this picture in a theatre setting. So like I'd said before, I asked people to think about where they would want the picture taken, where they remember certain feelings during the pandemic, or where they think the environment might portray what happened for them. And V is a really accomplished anaesthetist. She's got years and years of experience, and this is her stomping ground next to an anaesthetic machine, looking after patients one after the other and getting them through surgery. And actually what that room turned into, the theatre room, it turned into makeshift intensive cares. And in that room, which would normally have one person being looked after by one anaesthetist and a group of surgeons and a theatre team, turned into a room with 3 nurses with 3 patients at the best, all fighting over a very similar oxygen supply, with anaesthetic machines that weren't meant to be used for intensive care patients. And the reason I love this picture is because it's completely, we tried everything with the lights on, but it was completely blanching. And we turned the lights off, and there was just theatre spotlight that happened to hit V. And we took a few pictures, and there's a bit of contrast in this picture. I like that the anaesthetic machine is sort of in the glow of it, but I also like that the spotlight's on V. She's the person that came in and helped so many of us when we were struggling because of her experience. And she talks a lot about how sort of the value of who we are and the various things that impact our value as doctors, and what makes us feel like we are valued, things like exams and that sort of thing. But actually what it comes down to is having that experience, and she felt incredibly proud to be able to walk in and help. And so if you look at V's face here, this is how I felt looking at the picture. There's a sense of pride, but there's also a sense of vulnerability. But actually in her hand, the green thing that you can only partially see, so that's a bag that fills with air and oxygen. And when you squeeze the bag, it's connected to the patient's breathing tube, and it delivers that air. So while she's got vulnerability in her face and the surrounding is dark because it's a dark time and it's a dark atmosphere, when she squeezes the bag, she gives that patient air. And that's what I was trying to get across. And I know that not a lot of people would get that. And that wasn't necessarily the purpose of the image overall. But to me, that's what I'll always remember, is that the power was really there and we could do as much as we could. But in between the vulnerability, there was experience and there was knowledge and there's the sort of the ability to just go in and try. So yeah, that's what this, and I think it's quite, one thing I tried to do with the pictures is I wasn't afraid to just take a front on picture, because I wanted that the person is the focus for me. And I like the idea that the person is looking back and piercing through, because I want the person looking at it to think about what that person might be thinking. I want it to be provocative, and this is sort of probably my entire collection of pictures I've taken, probably my favourite picture. Wow. Next image, please. So this is sort of, I've taken quite a few pictures in black and white, and they're always quite hard decisions to choose whether to keep them in the natural colour or to move them over into black and white. I tried quite hard to think about the scene and whether they might be scenes that sort of stand still in history or whether they're more about the person. This is one of the pictures where the person in the image isn't looking back. This is one of my consultants where I was working. She's an intensive care consultant, Dr. Peters, incredibly experienced. And there was a time before COVID where I went to work, and all of those times, no matter how complex the patient, she was there with the answers. And, you know, we would go around on our ward rounds as the juniors, and your role as the consultant is to have everyone turn to you and ask you what to do next. And by the nature of an intensive care patient, it usually means that everything has already been tried and someone has to think outside the box. And in this image, we're in one of the side rooms on the intensive care. The blinds are down and Dr. Peters is looking at the screen for the ventilator. And to me, that brings back a lot of memories of looking at the ventilator, which is giving you so much information about 8 or 9 different numbers second to second, and telling you all the things that are going into the patient in terms of air and what's happening in the patient's lungs. And there's also a heap of options which you might be able to manipulate small amounts to try and get things a little bit better. But there were points where we would reach where you'd run out of things to do and you're just looking at it for answers, and you're trying little things and seeing if things get slightly better over a few minutes. And that's what this image reminds me of. But also, if you look at Dr. Peters' arms, they're folded. And it's that, I don't know if that wasn't planned, and I don't know what that necessarily might represent to someone looking, but to me, that's someone who's ready and prepared and still going. And I've always seen her as someone who is, you know, really commanding, really ready, knows what to do. And this is why it was so powerful when people were sending me in their reflections and their thoughts, because she writes 2 or 3 paragraphs talking about how hard she found it and how vulnerable she felt and how paralyzed she was in situations where she wanted to do more but felt like she couldn't. And we were restricted by the number of us we had compared to the volume of patients we had. And I think that contrast, you know, I looked at this image and saw someone who was fearless and received, you know, a paragraph about someone who had loads of anxiety about it, just like the rest of us. And it's incredibly powerful you might think that having a leader who displays, you know, is open about their fears or open about their worries is a bad thing, but it's incredibly empowering to have someone say it's okay to feel like this. Even with all my years of experience and all my knowledge, having been through so many other things and seen so many patients in my lifetime, I still feel vulnerable. I still feel paralyzed. I still have bad dreams and nightmares, and I'm still experiencing the trauma. And that's actually empowering, because you're thinking, actually, everyone is going through this, and everyone I'm working with is going through this. It's okay to feel rubbish and still feel down in the dumps about it, or not know how to feel. So that's what that image represents to me. I think it's someone who's incredibly inspiring, but who also is willing to afterwards talk about how they felt in an open way. And I'm very grateful for that. Next picture, please.
Oh, sorry.
So a lot of the images that I've taken do give off a somber vibe. I've used, darkness to really recreate the atmosphere or the feeling in many of the rooms that we were in. But this is Hadley, and he's a ray of sunshine. And he works in the emergency department, and he's an emergency nurse. And this is the image of Hadley that I would see every time I went to A&E as a member of staff in A&E, or when I used to go as a member of a different team and see him there. He's incredibly friendly, incredibly approachable, and incredibly happy. And I wanted to have images like this, and these weren't planned either. I pulled out my camera and asked if I could take a picture and explain what I was doing. And he smiled in the picture, and there's no part of me that wanted to say, actually, I want you to think about, I'd already said what the project was about, and he chose to smile. And I thought that was great, because I think there's some stoicism there. There's strength through the pandemic. We're going to move on from this. This will be something we all remember, but it shouldn't, I hope, change us in terms of the great bits of everyone's personalities and why we chose to do healthcare. And he talks about in his reflection, he's so happy, but he talks about how, people made him feel embarrassed for going into nursing, or described it as being just a nurse. And he turned up to work during the pandemic, and he was a frontline hero. And he felt vindicated for his decision, and he was so proud to be able to help. And I think there's a few pictures that I have taken, and a few more that I'm going to post in the coming few weeks, but there's a few more people smiling. And I want people to know that it's not all doom and gloom. We rallied around each other, we were there for each other, and all these people that I'm posting pictures of, I feel so happy every time I do it, because they've become family. And that, we go to work, and work is always made by our colleagues, but we move on so quickly in medicine. We have short placements, but with the group of people that we spent this pandemic with, we will always be a family. And that's what this image says to me. This is the last picture I chose to share, and this is the front picture in the Metro article that I wrote in. This is one of my colleagues, James, and I'd probably describe him as my work husband, in that we are both anaesthetic trainee doctors, and we've both gone through the same rotations at the same hospitals together. And I think our experiences were somewhat parallel in that way. And he's wearing one of the respirators. So for the entirety of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about PPE. Where we were working, we were really lucky in the sense that we always had PPE available, and the management staff and the senior doctors always made sure of that. But because of that supply of PPE was always down to what we got from the government, or whoever the central holding of PPE was, they were rationing out to all the hospitals. So we were given masks, and whatever mask we got was the one we used. But there's a process when you're checking masks, and one of those things is to check that it's airtight. That's all to do with facial structure. I had to sort of get rid of my beard, and you put on the mask, and there's this whole thing you do where you try and smell this really disgusting substance, and if you can smell it, then with a hood over your head, then the mask isn't airtight. And they stopped doing that because they had no control over what masks came. And after the pandemic ended, well, I say after the peak of the wave, they started to get more of the masks at a larger supply, as supplies grew. And so they started testing us again. And a lot of us most of us found out that the masks we were using through the pandemic weren't airtight for us. But James and I were given this mask because this one we could pass the test on. And it has 2 respirators on it. And if you see the mask from front on, it's exactly what you described with the miner scene, Susie, where you've got that image of someone who looks like they're a miner, and and it's also quite looming, and your voice completely changes, and it is really difficult for someone to understand you, which makes everything worse. And you look a bit like Bane out of Batman, really. And then the worst thing about this mask is it's so suffocating and so painful. The rubber on the grey bit that you can see cuts into your nose. So that was the mask, and you can see next to James there's a visor, and this is once again in the theatre environment, and he's sat on the theatre table that would normally have a patient undergoing surgery, but unfortunately had a lot of our intensive care patients on it. And the image here was planned in the sense that I'd, asked him the same thing I'd asked everyone, that we'd go to a space that he would always remember the pandemic in. And he sat down, and in between us taking pictures, I sort of was walking around just trying to find an angle or trying to find a way to tell the story that he might tell. And this was, he was sort of exhausted with wearing the mask already, and it hadn't been long since he'd put it on for this picture. And it was cutting into his nose. But also, indirectly, to me, this image just shows someone who's exhausted and is just so tired. And the hand on your lap thing, if someone's posing for a picture, they've got their hands behind their backs or crossed over their front. But this hand on your lap just shows a bit of vulnerability to me. And this is, I can't tell you how much I felt, how he felt. It's just exhausted, and I still feel exhausted. I think a lot of people, whether they want to admit it or not, I'm not afraid to admit that I feel quite burnt out, and that definitely has an impact on your personal life and your work life. That image of just closing his eyes and feeling done with it, but that's momentary, because the eyes open again, he gets up and he carries on working, and that's what a lot of our colleagues did. And I can see why this was a front image in the Metro, of the many pictures I've taken of the many amazing people that let me, because this was in that environment where things are a little bit messy, and this, it still brings back bad memories, even though there was no patients in the room at the time. We'd just gone back to the scene of the crime, really. That ends all of those pictures that I've taken. And that's the article where I spoke a bit about how we all felt. I was really grateful for one of the Metro editors for sort of wanting to hear our stories and why I'd taken these pictures in the first place. That link can be found on my Instagram bio at Priyan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Priyan, for talking so extensively about your work. I'm going to exit the share, but by all means, if you want to, I can sort of get the images back up again. I've made some notes while you were speaking, actually, so maybe I'll just cycle through. I just want to flick back to this image and say it really is iconic, I think. To me, it says so much, and what you describe about the PPE situation and trying out the mask, it's kind of educational as it is like historic, kind of, because on the surface, if I was to know nothing about 2020, I'd say, well, it looks a bit dystopian with the lighting, and this person looks quite upset. But then it's interesting how you said that there at the beginning you would be doing these tests with the smells and to see if it could come through, and it's such a key part of the narrative around the pandemic in hospitals, so it's impressive you managed to capture it so well. What I'll do is I'll get out of here, and then I'm just going to go through a few notes I've made, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I was going to say, first of all, I'm glad you included the emergency nurse Hadley. Is that?
Yeah.
Because it's quite a nice shift in tone with his smile, and I like how you described it as a sort of defiance in sort of resistance in the face of like hardship. And his anecdote I was particularly moved by, saying how up until now, as a sort of, he'd always been questioned about being a nurse, as if that wasn't a credible career path, and now finally people get it, and he's kind of being given some acknowledgement about how skillful and difficult the job is. I sort of had a question for you, because you mentioned vulnerability, that you want to capture it, and I just kind of wanted to know, why is it so important for you to find this within the subjects you photograph?
That's quite a tough question to answer, actually. And I'm not sure. I just find it so much more interesting. People are their true selves and they're honest, and the facade goes. And I think in healthcare professions, the idea is that we're meant to be really strong and invincible. And there was an expectation, whether we want to admit it or not, that NHS doctors and NHS nurses would obviously go to work and go in regardless of what their risk was, and treat people that were unwell. People were worried about leaving the house, let alone going into a ward where every single person that was breathing there, other than your colleagues, had the virus. And we were wearing these masks that supposedly protected us. And there's, whether the public would want to admit it or not, there was this expectation that we would go in. And that was matched by a lot of us. There was an expectation, and a lot of us wouldn't want to do anything different. Why the hell would you want to become a doctor or a nurse or be involved in any healthcare professional capacity if you didn't want to be someone that would walk towards the problem? And I think that's the thing. You're expected to be strong and willing to cope with anything, but actually we weren't coping at all. We were going in and fighting these fires, worried that we would catch the flames. And on top of that, we didn't anticipate the level of emotional sort of pain that would come of it. The shift didn't end at 12 hours. It went on for the next 12, where we were at home ruminating and thinking about what went wrong, or those patients that didn't make it that day, or the one that we just admitted that we're hoping makes it through the night. And we were vulnerable. And I think the public really rallied behind the NHS, and there was a lot of clapping, and there was a lot of, we got from local businesses who were understandably immediately struggling. They still found it in their hearts to support us and give us food and that sort of thing. And that was there. But I still think, the more I think about it, and this might sound harsh, there's still an expectation that we would turn up. In no one's minds would it be that we wouldn't. Because are we invincible? I don't know. But I really think the images show that we're not invincible. We're not, impregnable, unbeatable. We're vulnerable, and we felt things, and we will never forget those things. And we're not unique. I'm only telling one side of the story. There were people at home who lost loved ones. There were people that were patients there and felt incredibly vulnerable and trusted people like us to come in and do something for them. And I can only tell the story that I know, and that's what I know, and that's what I'm trying to tell. But I think one thing that has come is I've never felt so people I've known personally as to when I've taken these pictures and spent that half an hour with them trying to get that picture of them that represents what they went through. Because everyone loses their professional facade, and suddenly they become worried about how they might look, or start thinking about how they feel, and all of those things that seem to be at the back of professionals' minds suddenly comes to the forefront, and they become their actual person again, and the curtains come down a bit. And I think that's the thing. I've gotten to know people I've known for years, some of them, so much better because of this process. And it's reminded me that actually everyone has a story to tell, and we forget that. And that's what I want to do with this project. Right now, COVID is what's happening, but I want to extend it to other people that have stories to tell. So the vulnerability thing is so key to that, because if you look at the Instagram world, or what we're now exposed to in social media and everything else, everyone seems like they're doing so well. But actually, honesty is king right now, and that's where you can really connect to someone. I just want other people to know that it's okay to be vulnerable, even if you're meant to be the one that's not supposed to be.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for going into that quite tricky question. And before I respond, I'm going to say, everyone, thank you for watching so far. There is a option for chat. If you could kindly ask any questions, I'll be checking in shortly. So any questions, please write it and enter it on the bottom right, and then we can respond to that in a bit. But yes, going back with vulnerability, I think that's right. I definitely wouldn't think that people would be scared. You know, you think, oh, they must be scared, people working in medical professions, as I have friends that work in the NHS, but you sort of just assume that everyone will turn up to work. And as we know, you know, the toll on people like yourself has been huge. And I think what's really great about your project is that not only you're taking these portraits, which have some of the things you've said I never would have known from just looking at the photos, such as the symbolism of the bag being held by the woman, sorry, not the woman, the your colleague who has that sort of air bag in her hand. Yeah, that's really nice detail that I never would have known had you not said that. And it's really interesting listening to you that you can kind of decode all these machines, which to me I have no sort of emotional connection to, but you kind of can identify them as these really helpful tools to save people's lives. And that's quite interesting. I was going to ask Susie, was wondering if you, having listened to Priyan, what your response was and whether you've had anything to say.
For starters, I loved getting the inside story on what it's like, because I've just kind of imagined, and hearing about the vulnerability, the burnout, the taking it home with you at night, the family feeling, the fellow feeling amongst your colleagues, and the photos, which I love, kind of they evoke two slightly opposed ideas in me. One is a feeling of great calm, not that these people are superhuman or anything like that, but a kind of stoical calm and strength, as in the picture of V, even the one of Manon. I think it's something to do with compositions, the way that the figures are fairly central, and the fact that the poses and the kind of verticals and horizontals are quite sort of stable and balanced. They're not hectic. They're not kind of at an angle or romantically askew. And then the other slightly contrasting view is to do with the vulnerability and the contrast, which I'm interested in between the figure and the machine. These gleaming, and to a medically ignorant person like me, slightly perplexing and alarming structures, machines, and the vulnerable figure, the exhausted James, is it? Yes, and Dr. Peters, who to me looks slightly resigned. You said her arms are folded, or and she looks kind of ready for work. She looked to me really worn out and quite bleached, with these resigned arms. And the other thing I just wanted to say was the dark and the light, the Rembrandt effect in I think V and Dr. Peters and James. I just love the way you make shapes like in a painting. The light and the dark form shapes that are kind of, they're not realistic. They create other forms and other entities. They're not just the figure and the space. The light and the dark make their own designs and their own shapes, which is very dramatic. And it's like the battle between two forces, a contrast between forces that people are having to deal with. And yeah, I really like them. But I did get this kind of tension between vulnerability and stress, and a kind of calm and dignity. So that they're quite interesting in that way. They're not just evoking one mood or one idea or one emotion. There are various ideas and emotions held in tension, I thought.
Thank you, Susie. That's yeah, really interesting everything you raised there, actually. I was just spotted a question, if I may, which is from my father, Ron Jackson, which is to Susie, saying, has science fiction been a major influence in your work overall, or just during the period of 2004?
Thanks. I think it has been, although I wasn't really aware of it. My husband is very well read, and he put me in touch with H.G. Wells and various science fiction films, because my work deals with sort of wilderness and figures that are vulnerable in a big space and are overwhelmed by it. And so science fiction, especially space travel, have been quite congenial subjects for me. And then that thing of the, as I said, of the dark skies and the bright landscapes through shots of the moon and the planets, that fed into my beach scenes. I'm fairly ignorant about contemporary science fiction, but because I quite like the bizarre and the strange and the alienated, and because I quite like wilderness and danger and being overwhelmed by something bigger than yourself, I think science fiction, the spirit of science fiction, is something that's quite good for my work. I mean, I quite like to pursue that further, but I just haven't read a lot of it, apart from Wells and The Day of the Triffids, and watched quite a lot of space films.
Thank you. And Priyan, do you feel like you've been in a science fiction film, or is it just another day, another dollar?
I don't know. It doesn't, not really science fiction. It did feel out of this world, in the sense that, I don't know. I think when everything's in March, when everything seemed to begin, and there was this weariness about this thing that was coming, and this sort of thing in the distance. It was vague. It was spoken about, and we knew it was coming, and then we were trying to prepare, and then nothing happened for like, from the moment we started to prepare, nothing was happening. We just knew it was coming, and then suddenly it was like an avalanche. And I think at that point it was just muscle memory and just going and going and going. And I guess even when you look back, I wouldn't even say it felt like science fiction. It just felt like a weird movie, a weird nightmare that wasn't ending, and it always felt like something bad was still happening. Like, you know, in a horror movie where there's that sound and it builds up and there's an anticipation that something's around the corner and you know it's going to come, but you still jump. It just felt like a constant several weeks and months of that anticipation feeling, like what is going to happen next. And then suddenly it just started to fizzle and fizzle. And then in the last few weeks, I don't know how other people have felt, but as you know, I get the BBC sort of update on my phone, or the Sky News update, and it's just like, you know, more cases than whatever yesterday, and so that feeling has come back. That anxiety is like redoubled, because actually I didn't know how bad things would be. I just thought, in fact, I was so naive before it started. I just looked around and I was like, these are great people and we are going to tackle this thing, and I'm so glad that I get to be a part of turning up. There wasn't one part of me that I just felt so ready in my head that this was why I'd become a doctor, and this is, you know, what we're all about. And, you know, and then it happened, and I was like, I wasn't ready for that. I was so naive. So it wasn't necessarily science fiction. It was more like a horror is the genre I'd put it in. And now with everything, I never felt so nervous about something, except for like exams and, I don't know, first dates. But this is like, you know, if it does come back, and if it is anywhere near or even half of what it was before, like, I can't even imagine how. I don't think anyone's ready for that, in terms of the healthcare profession. We're probably more ready in terms of supplies, but less ready in terms of energy.
I relate. I also chip in a bit and say I relate to the horror, the horror, as that line is said from that book, Darkness, and what you were saying about, just from my perspective of falling ill from COVID in March, and then also the sensations and feelings I've had in my body, of hoping it would just end and things just continuing, and to the disbelief of everyone, including myself. And what you're saying as well, of anticipation, delay, and then avalanche, and then this kind of secular nature with the pandemic of, we know that there's been a peak. We're kind of unclear to what point it's been in the country. We certainly were aware in April and March when it's hit, and now we're back in the kind of, I suppose, getting more accurate numbers, but certainly it's not under control, the situation, which kind of reminds me back to that extract text of The Time Machine, and H.G. Wells sort of, I remember reading a little bit about the story, and he time travels throughout the book, and I don't know, it just, those are ideas that came to mind from that question. So
yeah, he goes forward millions of years, doesn't he? Or the narrator meets a man who's traveled millions of years in time, and then comes back to Earth again. I think comes back to this time again.
Yeah, and yeah, it's that, like in 2004, that the paintings you did, there's that kind of not really sure how things, we look back in time and see actions of what we're doing now. I suppose it's very interesting paintings in light of what's happened. I
find it quite uncanny. A friend of mine who's listening in, actually, she said, you must have a crystal ball.
Yeah, it like what you were saying, Priyan, as well, with this just intuition that you had, that you said at the time you knew things were going to happen, but you look back and you said it's still, you had no idea to the extent of what hell you were going to go through. I know that from the Metro article, I sort of made a note of, it said, I have never dealt with such a high volume of sick patients arriving relentlessly, and at times not knowing who I should treat first. Tears flow from all the stress and exhaustion. So I just wanted to say, I can't remember if those were your quotes from you personally or from your colleagues.
Yeah, that was a quote from one of the colleagues, who sort of, it was out of. So yeah, so it was just out of what.
It was
what
very
they
poignant.
Said.
The beginning of the Metro article.
Yeah, there's one, you know, unfortunately because of confidentiality and all of those things, I can't go into specifics, but there is, we remember a lot of our patients for a number of reasons, either because of our actions or their actions. And with COVID, because they all came in with the same symptoms and they had the same pattern of getting unwell and ended up going through the same things, there was a lot of blur, but there were a few patients who stood out, and it was based off just interactions. And there was this one particular person who stood out to me simply because, even though, and pardon my French, even though we were going through such a shit situation, particularly on their side, they were suddenly so unwell. And then, I wish I could tell you more about them and how it's so relevant that they were such in their career and the things that they did in their life, just how much of an impressive person that was. And then they were just, in this moment, had become, they're sort of taken over by COVID, and we still managed to laugh, and he sort of still cracked me up. And it was in this, you're going in and you're just expecting to have another one of your tough conversations, and actually in the middle of that we laughed, and that was unique, and that was someone I thought about when I went home, and it was the end of the Thursday shift, and I had the Friday, Saturday and Sunday off. And I remember over the weekend texting some of my colleagues to see how he was doing, and then turning up sort of the next shift that I was working, and his name wasn't on the list. And that happened with a lot of people, to be honest, but that particularly struck me because I'd invested a bit of my emotions into, and you try so hard not to, but I'd invested a bit of emotion into that person. So yeah.
I found it. I don't know if you can hear Priyan. Can you?
I can, yeah.
At the beginning of the Metro article, it's so sad. The man who made the joke and then he died.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the person you're talking about. At the beginning of
Yeah.
as far as I
Yeah.
remember, someone made he was very light-hearted at the beginning, you know, being very brave and funny, and then he died. It's very striking and sad.
Yeah, that's exactly who I'm talking about. And that's the thing. That was the, you know, but that's, you know, these people, they you can just tell from those interactions that there's definitely heaps of people at home who love this person so much because that's what they bring to the room. And that's the person that is now missing for a lot of people. I think that's what that reminded me of. And yeah.
Well, thank you both. I've got one more question up my sleeve, and then because we've done over an hour, I think, unless, you know, feel free to mention anything else, but I think that'll be my main question done and dusted. And it links to what the next question here, which says, to Priyan, by doing the photos, did you feel a sense of release from the woes of dealing with the COVID situation in the hospital? And I think I'll add to that to extend to Susie as well, which is that all three of us have responded to the pandemic, I think, by quite personal accounts of having a creative outlet. And one of the sort of things I hope to share with the talk today is the importance, like, that sharing information and experiences and writing, having some authorship over our experiences can provide some feeling of power to ourselves and education to others. So I'll first ask Priyan, and then I'll say it to you, Susie, if that's okay. So just about the therapeutic effects from doing the photographs of your colleagues, and how was that for you? And also, I remember we spoke earlier in the IGTV, you said that your colleagues took a while to open up, and it kind of became a bit of a group therapy for them to confront their own traumas. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
So during, people were thinking a lot during this whole thing about how to support each other. And there's an amazing psychiatry consultant. I say amazing because he is really unique in his ability to listen, which makes him so suited for the job he does. And he works at the hospital I was working at before, and his name is Dr. Hugh Grant Peterkin. And he set up this coffee club, and it was designed to be just before the change of shift in the morning. And if you could attend and there wasn't a patient that people needed to see, and it was just before our handover, and it was an open forum, and he just hosted it and sort of laid it open for people to talk about their feelings. I noticed that there were a group of people that would regularly turn up, and these were people that felt quite comfortable talking about their feelings, and there was the occasional few that didn't necessarily feel as comfortable but came to listen. And then there were a group of people that hadn't turned up, you know, for a number of reasons, either lack of opportunity to, or the rota, or whatever. But they had experiences like, this should be told. This is a story that should be told. You know, you've seen this one thing at the same place that I've worked in the same place, but I never noticed that, and you've noticed it. This is so interesting, and this is history unfolding where we happen to be in the thick of it. We should be telling this story. And I thought that these were stories worth telling because I was listening to them and amazed, even though I was potentially going through the same thing. So I started to talk to people about that process. And then one day I just decided to bring my camera in and ask, I don't know, blindly if I could take a few pictures of people. And some people said yes, and some people didn't know what I was up to, so they said no initially. And eventually what came of it was just initially talking to people about their feelings at the time while I was taking the picture. Sorry. And then after, they started sending me their thoughts, and that was amazing. That was like it's cathartic for me. I was doing something with people and opening up sort of what they were going through and feeling a mirroring of what I was feeling. And it was creative, and I'm not necessarily a creative person, so it was new for me. And for them, a lot of the people some of them hated writing about it because they found it so difficult to put onto paper, and they knew someone would read it. They were incredibly honest, and a lot of them after said that they found it cathartic. So yeah, it was a creative outlet for me. That's what I said in the Metro article, and it still remains that. And I hope it was for the people that, were open enough to let me take a picture of them in their place of work, to show their vulnerability and be honest about how they felt, not afraid that someone might read about their anger or disappointment or sadness and think that they were any less, or it might affect them professionally. They were just honest. And because of people like yourself, Monique, there's a platform now, and because of the Metro, people that have been interested from day one, and the followers and there's been so many people that I either know or don't know who've reached out to say, this is great, thank you so much. And, it goes such a long way. It goes such a long way because someone's listening to my colleague's story and knowing what they went through. And I think there's so many voices up and down the country. The NHS is one of the biggest employers in Europe. So many people will be going through or have gone through this thing. And I hope that there are people through the very small platform I have on Instagram who might read this and think, either come to know what people have gone through or feel an affinity with them. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a great outlet, and I hope it has been for the people that either feel a sense of pride or at least feel celebrated somewhat because they are heroes in their own right, and sort of want to continue on that, even if the sort of political rhetoric might have changed.
Right. Thank you, Priyan. And I'll ask the question to Susie, which is, I'll sort of change it around a bit, just to that you responded to the pandemic with your C19 works.
Yeah.
How did that feel for you? Did it help you process the experience at all?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was lucky to be locked in with something to do. I wasn't going up the walls with boredom or anything. I had something that was occupying me, that was preoccupying me. And also I felt lucky to have found a new subject that sort of connected with so many things I'd been concerned with in the past. The masked figure, light, neon, the sci-fi element in the beaches with the virus and so on. So I think also that I found a subject, but as with art in general, I've often found this, that out of very bad things, negative emotions, comes the pleasure of transforming the negative into something positive or entertaining or engrossing, so that you turn all the mess and the unstructured disorder inside you into something that has a certain structure, while at the same time leaving open the possibility of the disordered or the wild or the overwhelming. What I'm trying to say is that in my own work, I obviously make have a kind of. You all right, Monique?
Sorry, just had a message that made a noise. Sorry about that. It's interrupt you. Keep going, Susie.
Oh, I'll just say, and I'll finish here, but just wanted to say, in my own painting, I make structure and order, as you have to in a painting or a drawing, with form, and as you know only too well, with design and composition. But I also like to leave open the possibility for mess and disorder. It's Apollo and Dionysus, it's both structure and the loss of structure, and what's known and what's neat and what's formulated, and something that's mysterious and unknown and possibly slightly out of control. And that's what I meant about the bed being a liminal space in my COVID pictures between a known world and something that's coming at you that's unfamiliar and frightening. I hope that makes sense. But I mean, in answer to your question, yes, it was a positive experience, and especially through quarrying this very negative and frightening subject matter and trying to turn it into something dynamic, even exhilarating.
Oh, well, that's excellent. Yeah, I think I strongly relate to what you both said, and I'm glad that you both sort of been very resilient, I think, and had very different experiences. And
Easy enough for me though, Monique. I was locked at home. I wasn't on the front line in danger of, everybody breathing COVID all over me. But I just wanted to say, I felt it's lucky enough for me.
Well, this is what's interesting, I think, about us three and people who are sort of logged in right now and will watch this later, is about sharing different experiences, because there's no way that there is one singular way of experiencing a pandemic. And I think that in order for us to get a 360 view of how it has impacted us, we've got to speak to people from different backgrounds. And I believe people have their own hardships and they come in different ways. And but what is universal between us is that there's been this need to create. And I think each of us have identified the chaos. And I think that by sort of producing something, in this case visually, there is a sense of order that can feel quite therapeutic from doing that. I've just seen, I've just seen in the chat box, it says, just to say I've received a greater perspective from listening to both Priyan and Susie, being open and honest about their work. Much appreciated. That is good. I was going to say actually a sneaky little micro question before.
Thank you.
Is basically about the process. Very, very quickly, I was going to ask you both. Firstly, Susie, with your process, could you just outline how you make your works? Because obviously when we look at them on a PowerPoint, you can see that there's paint or layers of ink on card. And I remember you mentioned me before that you used found materials. So I was wondering if you could just briefly touch on that.
Well, we had deliveries of vegetables and cardboard boxes, and because I was short of materials, I made use of cardboard, which I'd used before as a surface. So I'd prime the cardboard and then paint on it. And then I'd also use paper, and then I got a delivery of art materials, and so that was good. So paper and cardboard, and I like the contrast of kind of sharp lines and then more blurry, soft areas. So I would use washes of background that with either the brush or pastel or charcoal or something sharp and hard. So I'd get structure and loss of that thing of structure and loss of structure. And then I would also plop into the onto the surface these what I call cells, little areas of liquid acrylic which would blur out to create these kind of cellular atomic structures, little elements. So it was basically layers of acrylic and contrasted materials, creating, shapes and lines and hard areas and soft areas and figures in contrast to these rigid machines and so on. And just one more point, a contrast between the high-tech doctor or the high-tech machinery and the slightly... Did you get that, Monique?
It just flipped out annoyingly. So you said contrast between the high-tech equipment and...
Yeah, high-tech doctor and equipment and the patient who is a mess on the bed. His messy shape covered in wires on the bed of the poor patient.
It's usually the other way around.
The mess of the doctor.
Yeah.
I'll just pull up an image while I'll say, Priyan, could you just outline your process? Like, what kind of camera do you work digitally? Do you use post editing like Photoshop or anything?
So about 3 years ago, I picked up a Nikon camera, like a base camera, and I've still used that because I don't think I'm personally that advanced to understand what the difference between a base might do and what a £2,000 body might do, but maybe someday. The lenses, I decided that I'd only use one lens for this. I used a 15mm lens, and it's got a very low f-stop. So what that means is that it can create a lot of blur behind the subject, and it can allow a lot of light in. So the problem with a hospital environment, like you've mentioned before, is that it's really blanching. The lights are there to illuminate everything, so everyone can see what everyone's doing, and the walls are really often quite light. And what that means is when you turn a light on, it ruins every picture that you might take, because it's just a blanching light. So it takes away from features, but also takes away contrast. It takes away sort of, there's no real shadow, because it just illuminates everything. So I had to do a lot of work trying to figure out how to do things in the dark, and where to put the light. And that was the most frustrating thing. So I wouldn't describe it as a process, but just something I had to overcome. And then the other side of the process, that was trying to manipulate the environment so that I could tell the story. And then the person I was taking the picture of had to give in to sort of what they were feeling at the time, and that interaction was a big factor. And then after I took the pictures, I was just doing standard editing on Lightroom, playing with the contrast. I tried not to change the hue of any colors or anything like that, but I did sort of, if there were things that needed to be highlighted, I tried to focus on them. I don't use Photoshop, so it was more just having a base imaging and tweaking sort of dark and light areas a bit more. And sort of some pictures were so dark that I had to increase the exposure slightly, but that was about it from my side. And frankly, I'm still learning. I've learned a lot doing this project, because I never really used to take pictures of people. It was more landscapes and animals and that sort of thing, things that were further away from emotion. But with this one, I really wanted more focus on the right things. So yeah, that was my process. So in summary, a standard basic DSLR, a really good lens, which I didn't change for the entire thing, because I wanted every frame to be sort of done the same way. And it helped me because it allowed a lot of light in, because of the f-stop I mentioned. And then, yeah, that was about it. That was it. And then just a bit of post-editing afterwards.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm just going to show Susie's image also, although there we go, sorry. So we can kind of just have reference to what Susie mentioned before about the high tech versus the patient on the bed. And thank you both. I'll just come out of here and sorry. Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Monique. Thanks, Priyan.
It's been lovely talking with you both. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. So, oh, I can just see here, what sort of advice did you give the subject of your pictures when you take their picture? In a minute, can you respond, Priyan?
So very quickly, part one was, let's go to a place that reminds you of your time working, and particularly an emotion you thought of. And then the first few pictures I took were just pictures for them to calm into the environment, because it's quite, being in front of a camera, in front of a colleague can be quite tricky. And then I would just ask them to think about their feelings and their thoughts in that moment, and they didn't have to speak about them. And then while they were busy thinking about them, you could see in their expressions what they were feeling, and that just came out, and it was particularly natural. And I had to apologise a lot because I took a lot of rubbish pictures, so I had to keep trying. I knew the image that I wanted, or I'd seen it happen, but it wasn't quite there, so they had to be really patient with it.
Awesome. That's brilliant. Thank you, and thanks Ricky for asking. Okay, well, have a good evening both. Thanks everyone for joining, and I will put this on the website.
Thank you. Thanks, Priyan. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Susie. Nice to meet you.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
Thanks.